I wanted to tell you about the Addis paradox. The Addis paradox is that we are having a discussion about financing for development in Africa when the discussion becomes universal. And when most of the discussions were about Africa, they didn't take place in Africa. That's the Africa paradox, or the Addis paradox. And we are very proud of this paradox because it really comes at the right time for the continent, because things are changing quite dramatically in the continent, and I'll come to that in a minute. But before I do so, I want to actually follow some of the recommendations of the South Center for this panel, which is to respond to a number of questions that are in everybody's minds. And I think very important questions, because they will allow us to frame what discussion are we having. And for me to be able to do that, I have to talk about the universality of this conference. So this is a conference where we are actually addressing sustainable development for everybody, for all countries. Until now, it was more a pact, a deal, if you want, between developing and developed countries. This is supposed to be different. Supposed to be different. Is it? So that's the first question we have to ask. Because if it is really different, then we have to talk about another paradox. And that is the cappuccino paradox. A bit more attractive because you are in the land of coffee. The cappuccino paradox is about the fact that most of the discussions tend to concentrate on economics. And when we think that economics are going right, we add the social. And if we have the leisure of having good social outcomes, we add the environment. And in Rio, we decided that this was not going to be the right way of approaching this discussion. We had to give equal prominence to the three. If we are going to give equal prominence to the three, that is the definition that we have agreed on sustainable development, we cannot act as if we're getting a cappuccino. Coffee is there. If possible, you add some milk and then you sprinkle some, cocoa or whatever you want to make it nice. It has to be a real mix. And that mix is not necessarily happening, because you see the moment there is a crisis, let's say now in Europe, because it's the one in the news, the first thing you scrap is the environment. The second thing you scrap is the social, because you have to fix the economy. And fixing the economy has become tantamount to pleasing the markets. And pleasing the markets has become tantamount to pleasing the financial sector. And pleasing the financial sector has become tantamount to saving the banks that cannot fail. And this is really a very strange cappuccino. And I think we have to go into a completely different direction and get into a situation where we don't have these layers, and rather than having layers, we have really something that is vertical, that has the same degree of importance. And that is why this conference is so unique. We are discussing three big issues this year. A climate conference in Paris is the first opportunity to get a new deal on climate for a long time. We know what happened with the previous deals. Then you have an additional layer of complexity by the end of the MDGs and the replacement by the SDGs. And then, of course, you have the means of implementation for all of this that some have reluctance in linking with the discussion on financing for development, as if it was rational to separate. It is part of the same discussion. But of course, everybody wants to keep their cards closer to their chest and negotiate as many tracks as possible, because you never know what is the outcome of the other negotiation. And if you don't, you better not give up too much on A, because you may suffer on B and C. Or you are putting your bets on B, you try to be very defensive on A, because you don't know what may come out of B, and that has a consequence on C. So everybody's doing this maths, and everybody's, of course, very concerned that if we don't have a good outcome in Addis, it's going to influence the rest of the year. So the bets are out, and everybody wants to have the best possible outcome. I'm not going to enter in so much detail about the three contentious issues that are still being negotiated, because we have negotiators here. They will be able to tell you what are the bets and what are the issues for developing countries that are of importance. But if I do justice to what was requested from the South Center for the panelists, I would say that FFD, nevertheless, is different from Monterrey and Doha because it focuses on both financial and non-financial sources of funding. There are no new financial resource commitments. Most commitments focus on enhancing the policy environment to leverage financial and non-financial resources. So we have to lower our expectations, what you were saying. With respect to ODA in particular, development partners have merely reaffirmed their commitments, but we know what happened to those commitments before. And we keep just pushing the deadlines for the same commitments. There are no new commitments, as we know. The text right now makes concrete time-bound and concrete commitments on energy that aim to double the global rate of energy efficiency and conservation, and ensuring universal access to affordable, reliable, modern, and sustainable energy services for all by 2030. This is good, but it encapsulates a danger, which is in order to meet such a target, you may be greening ODA, which is just to double count what you do for climate financing and what you do for ODA, which was supposed to be two different tracks of funding promised in terms of commitments by development partners. So we have to be very attentive about this danger. In addition to the financial commitments, the text includes a proposal to substantially reduce illicit financial flows by 2030 with a view to eliminating them. And in the case of Africa, this is a theme very dear to us. We published a report about this issue by a commission led by President Becky. I'm the vice chair of that commission. Our estimates are that we lose between $50 and $60 billion a year through illicit financial flows. And all these commitments would have been welcome, but there are some caveats. The agenda calls on other institutional bodies, including the IMF and the World Bank, to publish estimates of such flows to facilitate tracking. However, the IMF and the World Bank argue that they cannot track illicit financial flows because they are covert activities which do not leave a paper trail. It is not clear whether, without the cooperation of the Bretton Woods institutions, honestly, the other bodies called upon by this text are going to really be very excited about dealing with this issue. The commitment to develop an infrastructure forum, it's another one, is not a funding commitment per se, but a mechanism to improve coordination and coherence in existing infrastructure-related funding mechanisms. This mechanism will not necessarily close Africa's infrastructure gap, and we are not really looking very excited about what the text is providing. So you have basically no real new money being announced or anything close to financial commitments being announced, and it's very clear for us that you are just talking about the policy environment. Now, if you are going to talk about the policy environment, the issue is it going to preserve or not our policy space? Because when you go too much in the direction of defining the policy environment, you must be careful, because what is the give and what is the take? Maybe we are giving too much and not taking anything, because there is nothing really very concrete. Commitments are not very clear. One example is debt and how we treat debt. External debt has been at the core of the Financing for Development Conference 2 in Doha. which was a follow-up because of the commitments made with EPIC and others in Monterrey. The outcomes from both Monterrey and Doha include clear commitments to an international debt workout mechanism. But what we know is that little has been achieved in this course so far. The review of debt sustainability frameworks gained momentum following the 2008-2009 crisis, financial crisis. There has been progress in introducing collective clauses in bond contracts. However, the debt situation in developing countries will essentially depend on a comprehensive treatment of all components of debt and debt restructuring. And it is crucial for FFD3, this one, to introduce clear mechanisms promised already and engage all stakeholders to build on a consensus on how to close gaps, many gaps that exist in the current financial architecture. Remember that since 1970, there have been 180 sovereign debt restructuring initiatives. The future international architecture needs concrete and binding mechanisms and not this plethora of ad hoc-ish arrangements that we have witnessed. Little progress will be made without effective financial standards, including the establishment of debt audits, with commitments to canceling debt found to be illegitimate, as we know. Development partners prefer to address external debt on a country-by-country basis. And this text encourages initiatives to support non-EPIC countries with sound economic policies to address the issue of debt sustainability. Now, for us, one of the big issues in Africa is what is considered to be debt sustainability in terms of the ratios proposed by the IMF that are very restrictive to the transformative policies that we are promoting. Another very important example that we want to link to this debt discussion is calls for countries that experience shocks like the Ebola-affected countries to really be the subject of more considerate debt relief steps. And we have been proposing this very vigorously at the Economic Commission for Africa for the 3 affected countries. Another example that I want to mention very en passant, very quickly, is the tax issue. But I know that in this room, or rather at this table, we have some colleagues in the panel that know the intricacies of the current negotiation on tax, which is one of the contentious issues still remaining. And maybe they will share with us some of the insights they have. To conclude, how adequate is the follow-up mechanism, and how can we make all of these various promises part of a more accountable system, is of course a preoccupation to all of us. What we know is that we in Africa are not putting our bets just on a negotiation like this one. Africa has been really very vigorously promoting its own agenda. And its own agenda is now influencing how it negotiates, not the other way around. This is new. For the first time, African countries, 2 years ago, decided to establish a high-level committee of heads of state, 10 heads of state, that are responsible, the committee is still in existence, for all the negotiations for the post-2015 process. And what this high-level committee does is basically to define what are the interests of Africa in relation to the Africa-defined agenda, which is spelled out in the form of a vision and aspirations, Agenda 2063, and also in terms of a 10-year plan that has been approved in March this year by the Conference of Ministers of Finance and Economic Development of the continent. And if you look into what is behind these various proclamations and documents, it's about industrialization. And it's about industrialization in a very different way from what has been done by other regions, because we are latecomers. Latecomers have a lot of problems to deal with. Latecomers don't have the wind at their favor, but they can have something that is quite unique. They can learn. And they can learn from others' mistakes, and they don't need to go through the same. And this is very much the way Africa is discussing its industrialization process. We have three advantages that we are taking into account. The first is the fact that we are very strong in certain commodities. Our natural resources are pretty well known, and we are very bad on value addition, so we know that part of our entry into industrialization is going to be with value addition of our natural resources, particularly the ones we have a controlling stake in the world production. And there are many. The second entry point, of course, is the fact that we have now a huge African market. And this African market has been neglected, continues to be neglected. I think now there are lots of investors that are waking up to that potential. But what is really very interesting and fascinating is the shift in the discussion within the continent from development center debates to domestic resource mobilization for its own transformation. Basically, we're only going to transform if we use our own money. Everything else comes as an addition. But we have to take control of the future. And then the third big advantage is that Africa is going to industrialize at a time where renewable energy production costs are equivalent to fossil fuel. And never this happened before. So we have the luxury of actually going into a completely different route in the way we industrialize. We can have a green industrialization. And this is something that we have to elaborate, of course, in terms of the implications. I don't have the time to go through all the details, but I just wanted to give you a gist of the fact that Africa has its own agenda, and it's based on that agenda that it negotiates. Africa is conscious, and you can see it in the negotiations in many fronts, that all these different global compacts are not going to be the transformative element of Africa's future. We just have to be clear that we try to get the best we can out of the deal, but not confuse that deal with our future. Thank you.